Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. With measles epidemics raging in several different parts of the country right now, the issue of mandatory or compulsory vaccination is back in the news. And to help us understand how we got where we are with what were once thought of as being completely eradicated diseases, preventable diseases, now breaking out in parts of the country and actually putting the lives of children at great risk, is my guest on today's episode, Nick Diamond. He's a lawyer in Washington and teaches health law at the Georgetown University Law School in D.C. We are facing a crisis, a public health crisis, once again in this country, and we have to understand how we got here and what we can be doing better as a country to prevent diseases like measles, mumps, rubella, and other diseases that could so easily be treated with vaccination of our young. Stay tuned for a very important and fascinating episode. Hope you enjoy. Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. Vaccines are back in the news, but not perhaps for the reasons that you might think. They're in the news because of an outbreak of measles, a disease that was thought to have been wiped out almost 20 years ago. And to talk about how this could be happening in the United States today and what to do about the problem of vaccines, or the fact that many people today aren't having their children vaccinated and what the consequences are, I welcome my guest in the studio with us today, Nick Diamond. Nick, thanks so much for being on the program, and thanks for being here.
Thank you. I've been looking forward to it.
Nick comes here from Washington, D.C., and really is very knowledgeable about this subject. And we had a brief conversation about it. I'm really looking forward to exploring this with you. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Nick, how you come to this issue, what you do professionally as a lawyer in this area.
Sure. Yeah, I've been working in the public health space my entire career. I trained as a lawyer and an ethicist, which lines up very well for a lot of the issues that we find in the vaccine space. And over the years, I've advised the federal government as well as a lot of commercial entities on policy issues. And at the moment, at a firm called Avalier in D.C., I focus mainly on vaccines issues, so advise a number of large vaccines manufacturers on policy issues, regulatory issues, things like that. I also teach on the faculty at a few universities in D.C. at Georgetown Law in George Washington. It's a really nice mix of undergraduates and law students, depending on the semester, and mainly public health courses for that as well.
Well, this is really a public health crisis we're facing right now in a number of communities around the country with this outbreak of measles. And as you and I talked about a short while ago, it is also one of those rare moments where the intersection between drug companies wanting to sell their product, in this case a vaccine, and truly the interests of public health come very neatly together. So tell us about the problem that we're facing right now currently. The measles is very much in the news. Yeah. Tell us what's going on, and we'll set the table for our conversation.
Sure, yeah. And the big one lately has been Washington State, which has had that large outbreak going since really towards the end of 2018. I think at the moment maybe over 50 confirmed cases in some of the more populated counties in Washington too, which poses a lot of risk for spreading something like measles, which is highly, highly contagious. Excuse me. It's also been an issue in other states as well. So we've seen small outbreaks, comparably small outbreaks in Houston, in New York City as well, in certain communities there. So this is an issue that comes up really on a regular basis. And a few years ago, the other big incidence was around Disneyland in California in 2015, which had, I think, 130 some odd confirmed cases, so larger than Washington at the moment, but another instance where these things spread very quickly in highly populated areas.
Now, as we get into some of the reasons why these particular communities are the places where we've seen an outbreak of this very contagious disease, Disneyland, these couple of counties in Washington State, and as I understand it, an Orthodox Jewish community in New York City. we'll start to see some of the different reasons or different scenarios for lax vaccination or not complete vaccination of a population can lead to an outbreak like we're seeing in these different situations. But give us some of the background on measles itself and how it was that, as has been widely reported, measles was virtually eradicated in the United States as of the year 2000. That's really important background to understanding the problem today.
Yeah, absolutely. So saying a moment ago, measles, highly, highly contagious infectious disease. So much so that if someone touched a surface in a room and left, the virus could stay there on the surface for a couple hours after they had left the room. So very, very contagious. Symptoms are generally like a really bad case of the flu, more or less. And the measles vaccine has been shown to be very, very effective. So there are 2 recommended doses of the MMR vaccine. That's measles, mumps, and rubella, all rolled into one. And the first recommended dose is in the 12-month to 15-month range, and then a second dose between 4 years and 6 years old. So if you just have that first dose, it's about 93% effective. But if you also have the second dose, it's 97% effective. So very effective as far as vaccine prevention goes. But as you were alluding to, there were a lot of concerns that are still expressed, really, particularly around the MMR vaccine. So a number of years ago, there was a rather prominent study that was published that purported to show a correlation between the MMR vaccine and autism. And that study was sort of based on faulty methods, and actually its author retracted it shortly thereafter. But as these things go, once it was sort of out there in the public space, that was something that really caused a lot of concern. And I'm sure we'll talk about how the laws sort of leave some room for lower vaccination rates there.
Yeah, and I do want to come back to the issue of the vaccine controversy generally. And when we do get to that, I'll actually tell you a little bit about my personal connection to that. But just to finish understanding the nature of this particular disease, measles, you say that it can lead to flu-like symptoms, but in some cases, and this is from the experience before there were widespread vaccines available, it was also something that was in many instances fatal. Right?
Yes,
I mean,
absolutely.
Children, particularly young children, were vulnerable.
Yeah, exactly.
People who are immune compromised, women who are pregnant were particularly vulnerable, and there were a number of deaths in the United States from measles.
Right. Yeah, very much so. Definitely fatal, or can be fatal. I think the real concern is that group that's 12 months or younger, too soon to be vaccinated. So that, unfortunately, for young infants tends to be the most vulnerable group. Just interacting with other children, let's say, in a school setting or a daycare setting that may not have been vaccinated. So unfortunately, that tends to be the most at-risk group. I think globally, there have been, at least last year, I want to say about 135,000 deaths associated with measles. So it is also from a disease prevalence standpoint, a rather significant issue abroad as well.
Right. This was actually, there's an article that's in the New York Times today, perhaps it was yesterday, that there were, over 100,000 deaths globally in 2017 due to measles. So I guess those are cases in countries where they don't have vaccines widely available.
Right, yeah.
Or programs to implement vaccines.
Yeah, very much so. And so you can sometimes see sort of a lack of availability of vaccines. Sometimes there might be vaccines available, but cost and access becomes an issue as well. Unfortunately, many of the public health problems that we see around vaccines can be localized in countries that, for example, are experiencing some sort of unrest. There could be an ongoing civil war. We saw fairly significant measles outbreaks actually still going on in the DRC which as we probably saw in the news, a number of other infectious diseases sort of have been associated.
This is Congo.
Congo, yes,
In Africa, yeah.
And a few others as well, where it's very hard just to get the level of medical interventions that you need to a population that is ongoing in a wartime situation.
Well, and so this is a law show, so I want to understand how that fits in. And you are a lawyer too, so you'll be able to help us. So, in order to get to a point where you can say, as of the year 2000, in this country, we had virtually eradicated this disease. How does that happen? So you have a vaccine that's proven effective, highly effective, if given, and at the right ages it's given. Although I understand you can give it at almost any age, it can still be effective, right?
Absolutely.
Those are just the recommended.
Timing.
So if given, you have a high degree of efficacy with this vaccine, to get to the year 2000 and be able to pronounce we've wiped out measles in the United States, somehow that's got to be implemented. So how does that get done throughout the country?
Yeah, so the biggest entry point really happens at the state and local levels. So states, generally speaking, by way of the 10th Amendment, have very broad powers to protect and promote public health. And one of the main ways that they do that is through compulsory vaccination laws. And there is quite a bit of variation across the states in how this is handled, but generally speaking, you see all states having some degree of compulsory vaccination laws for early childhood education, so for secondary schools, sometimes even for daycares as well. And then you also have requirements that stretch all the way now to the university and college level as well. So those are sort of a way to, sometimes we say, just get everybody who walks through the door to ensure that people have a core set of just basic vaccinations, everything from smallpox to MMR to Tdap, which is for whooping cough mainly. So all of those ones that we know, if we vaccinate a high degree of the population, close to 100%, we can build up a bit of herd immunity, which generally helps for population health.
Okay, so in other words, in order to get your child into school,
right,
you have to show that they've been vaccinated in all of these different areas, including measles. So what has happened since 2000 that, as we know, has led to, in certain parts of the country, less than full compliance with these rules?
Yeah, and so these laws, they're not hard and fast requirements. They have some outs, if you will. So they provide for different types of exemptions. So if, let's say, we have a parent who has to fill out a form to attest that his or her child has received, the list of prescribed vaccinations for their child to, let's say, go to first grade. There are exemptions available, and they vary a little bit based on states, but generally you have what we call a medical exemption. So if the child has, and these are fairly rare, but if a child has, let's say, is immunocompromised, for example, or has a history of having allergic reactions to an ingredient in the vaccine, state law doesn't want to force that child to receive that vaccine. Actually, the law doesn't support that, which is why we have medical exemptions in every state. So a parent could avail himself or herself of that requirement, basically opt out of the requirement for one vaccine for all the vaccines required for school entry. And then we also have the tricky bucket, the bucket of non-medical exemptions. And these vary quite a bit by states, and there's been a lot has changed in recent years. But generally you have religious exemptions. So basically if it is against your religious beliefs to receive any vaccine, just one vaccine, it tends to be all of them, but you can avail yourself of an exemption to the extent that a state has that. So at the moment, there's only, I believe, 3 states that don't have a religious belief exemption, as it's called.
That don't have it.
That don't have it, okay. Yeah. And those are very rare. It's interesting, though, as far as con law goes, states are not required to offer a religious belief exemption. It just happens to be the case that that most do. But there are a couple exceptions, and this was something we saw California actually get rid of its religious belief exemption as a result of the ramifications of that 2015 outbreak.
That was the Disneyland.
The Disneyland one,
and
yes,
actually, a child died in that outbreak, as I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So, okay, so why don't they, that's interesting. Why don't they have to have a, I mean, that, is it that they don't have to have a religious exception, or that question has never been tested?
No, it has been. It actually goes back to, test my memory, I believe the 1920s. But, you know, the common way we think of religious liberty within the Bill of Rights is not really the same thing as offering. It doesn't really support offering a state being required to offer an exception based on religious belief. So over time, that's stuck. But in practice, you know, sometimes there can be different countervailing views in state legislatures that have basically made most of these religious exemptions happen to come into law.
So the religious exemption, I mean, that seems to me would explain what's going on in New York City in this Orthodox Jewish community, right? And there's a pretty serious number of measles cases there.
Yeah, there is. In
this current wave that we're seeing.
Yeah.
So this is fascinating to think about, that you can have a compulsory that you can force people to undergo a medical procedure. This isn't, I mean, this does require getting a shot, right? I mean, that's how the vaccine's administered. It's invasive in that sense. So it's fascinating to think that you can have this be a requirement. How do we deal with that as a matter of law in this country? How do we wrap our brains around the idea that we're forcing people to undergo this medical procedure and to receive this drug?
Yeah, this is one of the tensions I love talking with my students about, and particularly the undergraduates. But we have this tension built into the law between, particularly in the public health space, we have laws oriented towards benefiting the community, so benefiting the whole, the greater good. But at the same time, what it often takes to achieve that is restricting some measure of individual liberty in order to do it. So that's the requirement part to receive the vaccine. And states do have very broad powers to protect public health, so necessarily protect the population. They're broad powers, but they're not unlimited. They're not unfettered powers. So that's where we get those exemptions there as well. And certainly there would be no way to sustain a policy, let's say, that would require everyone to be vaccinated to the extent that if you said no, they would stick you with the shot. That sort of thing definitely would never be on the table. It was actually discussed in a case in the early 1900s. So we do have that really delicate balance between how much can we restrict some individual choice, individual autonomy for something we know that in the aggregate has a very positive effect for public health.
Well, and it would seem to me, too, that at least up until, and I'm just using this marker of the year 2000 because that's what seems to be widely reported as a date by which measles was thought to have been eliminated in this country. But it would seem up until then, too, that there was just a general acceptance of the community benefit. In other words, it's not just your own child that you're protecting from this horrible disease, but you're protecting other children around your child from getting this disease if your child gets infected. So that's the community benefit. It's not just a personal benefit to your own child, it's to protect others as well.
Yeah, very much so. And I think that often gets lost, I think, in the discussions that that it does have the individual benefit. We talked just about MMR and the 97% effectiveness rate if you have both doses. And we see similarly high benefits for other vaccines as well. And of course, that's just on the individual level. But if we think about the community, if we think about MMR, for example, you have that population, let's say the very young infants, less than 1 year old. So part of the idea of those high vaccination rates are that we have certain groups that just can't get vaccinated, and actually helps to protect them as well as just the community at large.
So so we talked about the religious issue a little bit. What are some of the medical exemptions that someone would claim? I mean, you mentioned allergic, and I'll just say my stepson, who's 17 now, is very highly allergic and has been diagnosed with autism, and you know, there's been great concern about exposing him beyond, you know, what he is already at risk to, just being around all kinds of cross-contamination, you know, risks. because of serious food allergies. How do you? I mean, that would be one example, if that you could claim, I would think.
Yeah, it would tend to be, and that tends to be something that they just work with the primary care physician to identify based on medical history, whether it fits the criteria. The criteria tends to be fairly permissive. Again, the idea is we don't want someone to get a vaccination if it's going to harm them to do it. That is just completely against everything medicine tells us to do and what the law tells us to do as well. But sometimes you'll have people who can have, let's say, allergic reactions to a particular ingredient in the vaccine. Tends to be rare, but it does happen. Some people could also be immunocompromised due to another medical condition, and therefore vaccinating them would put them sort of unnecessarily at risk. So we do see instances like that where, again, we want the individual to have the option not to receive it because we don't want them to be harmed in the process.
Are there ingredients in these vaccines that we know of that if you're going to have an allergic reaction, those are the particular ingredients you would tend to be allergic to?
Yeah, I get asked that a lot, actually. And it's really hard to pinpoint. It tends to be very, very individual specific. And that really goes back to just having a good PCP to work with to identify where the risk might be based on past medical history. But generally, these vaccines, the ingredients have been refined enough over time that they've really eliminated some of the common areas where there might be allergic reactions.
So, okay, so what's then been going on in the last 2 decades? Because we do know that the rate of compliance with this compulsory vaccine program across the country, state by state, has dropped off. I mean, there was a very high rate of compliance for many years, and then it has, in more recent years, it has started to fall off. Why? Tell us about that, first of all, and why have we seen that?
Yeah, I think there's been, we would call this vaccine hesitancy. This has been a big area, and this is something that the WHO has put right at the top of its global threats for 2019. It's something that the pharmaceutical manufacturers that are making the vaccines are very interested in, and something that individuals in the community are just generally interested in. And so we have different ways of looking at vaccine hesitancy. If we think of it on a spectrum, on one end we have people who would deny the value of vaccines, so that would be denial, and then on the other end we'd have just acceptance, and then the part in the middle is where it gets really complicated, because you can have individuals who, let's say, refuse certain vaccines but will receive other ones. And there could be different reasons for that. It could be something like complacency, other things on the priority list, for example. It could be something like a certain belief on the science behind vaccines and the effects that might have on an individual just to receive a vaccine. And that goes back to that study that we talked about earlier. And then we also just have access issues too, right? You have to be able, in most cases, to get to see your PCP. And you can do a lot of this, in this or the annual checkup. And for children, this, happens on a more regular basis than probably you and I. But then also in certain areas of the country too, we see a push to, let's say, make certain vaccines available through pharmacies, because it may be easier to get to a pharmacy in a rural setting than it is to get to a primary care doc. So there can just be access issues as well. And cost can sometimes be an issue. It's less so now than it used to be, and particularly for the types of vaccines we're talking about, those tend to be covered without any out-of-pocket costs by an insurance company. But then again, if you are not insured, if you're in between insurance plans, if you're not low enough income, let's say, to qualify for Medicaid, or you'd be the parent qualifying for Medicaid in this instance, that sort of churn in insurance coverage can also make access kind of a tricky issue.
Do the vaccine manufacturers offer programs for those kinds of situations, as they sometimes do for other types of prescription medications? Yeah,
most of them do. It varies a little bit based on the particular vaccine, and that really just comes from the fact that now, based on the way federal law is, courtesy of the ACA, these sort of preventive health measures are offered without cost sharing, so no out-of-pocket costs for all health plans. So before that, it was a little trickier, but that law has been in place really since the ACA came into being. So I guess that's getting on 6, 7, 8 years now. So it tends to be a little bit less of an issue. But there's also a bucket of adult vaccinations, things like the shingles vaccine, and that gets a little more complicated when we talk about out-of-pocket costs.
So, okay, so we, as you point out, we have a spectrum from denial all the way to acceptance.
Yeah.
And, for a lot of years, there was widespread acceptance of the value of compulsory vaccination. Maybe you didn't like it, but you would certainly
no one likes a shot. Yeah.
Right, you don't like it, but you accept it. That you accept the science, you accept the community health virtue of this program. But then you can start to talk about there being denial. And how did we explain that? And what exactly is the denial that we're talking about here? And how does this come about?
Yeah, and there are many different flavors of how denial plays out in this context. It could be, as we were saying a moment ago, denial about the science behind vaccines. Just some folks just think it's kind of bogus science that doesn't actually provide any health value. You could have people that have beliefs about the potential side effects of a particular vaccine. You also have other people who, just generally stay away from the doc and really would rather not have anything to do with that. So a lot of different flavors there, but generally these are things that are more of the personal belief bucket rather than, of course, the religious bucket's a separate thing.
Right.
But
well, and then we had a huge concern about vaccines that came about, as we talked about earlier, because of concern that I don't know if you'd call this a side effect or just a terrible consequence, a risk of autism and other developmental disorders that could be attributed to vaccines. That science has been debunked.
Right.
Pretty convincingly at this point, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Very convincingly. That particular study that tended to be the pain point was retracted. But, as a parent, though, if you see something like that, showing up in the news, it might create some doubt. And understandably, you want to, be protective of your child.
Right.
So that, that on a personal level, I think pushes back very strongly. And in part, we've sort of seen that carry through since since around the year 2000.
Well, so when you take all of that, all these different flavors, as you say, of doubt or outright denial about the value and virtue of vaccines, but we still live within the states that we live in that have differing degrees of compulsoriness to their compulsory vaccine laws. So there has to have been, as some doubt, some degree of doubt, and in some people, as that's grown, there has to be a certain permissiveness. Otherwise, you'd say, I know you've got doubts, but you have to do this anyway,
right?
Because it's compulsory. That's what that means. So talk about that a little bit. How in some parts of the country there has been a less than full commitment to making compulsory actually mean compulsory.
Yeah, and so this goes back to that religious belief exemption versus what we would call a personal belief exemption. And so, as I was saying before, the religious belief exemptions, we only have about 3 states now that don't have those. But we have I think it's about 18 states at the moment. This tends to change year to year, but around 18 states that have these personal belief exemptions. And these have sort of cropped up in state laws in the past couple decades, and that really meant to fill a situation in which a parent, for whatever reason, doesn't matter the reason, just doesn't want their child to receive the vaccine. It could be, let's say, general hesitancy around medicine and science in general. It could be specific, let's say, to the risk they think is associated, let's say, with the MMR vaccine. And so we find these personal belief exemptions that tend to be, popular isn't quite the right word, but it provides a fairly squishy out in states that have them for parents that, for whatever reason, don't want their children to be vaccinated.
Well, so what's the answer to that? Because here's this now pretty widely debunked study of linking vaccines with autism. Yet it's still out there, and there still are anti-vaxxers,
right,
as we call them. And how do we combat that? I mean, is more public education required here? You're not going to get these stories off the internet,
right?
Unless unless Google and Facebook and these other, platforms decide that they're going to play censor to what truly is fake news. But how do you deal with that?
Yeah, states have had different ways of dealing with that. So some have taken the extreme view. Maybe we'll think about that one first, where they've actually gone and introduced bills to remove the personal belief exemptions out of their state's laws. This is what California did, and the religious exemption in California's instance as well. I believe Washington just voted on or just passed a bill to remove that personal belief exemption, which they found by doing a little bit of studying around the outbreak that's been going on at the moment, tended to be the source of the issue. So they've sought to just remove that altogether. We've seen that also being considered in other states as well. Obviously, it's a very contentious issue, so these bills don't always sail through state legislatures.
But what's the contention? I mean, why are they contentious?
I think that's just people generally want to have control over how they provide care for their children, which is on a basic level very understandable. But public health has a different view on that for something that we know is safe and effective.
Well, I mean, that leads me to another thought about why we could be seeing a greater departure from these state requirements regarding vaccines, and that is the ability to enforce these rules, right? If the point of entry and therefore the point of enforcement is school, and you have people who say, I don't want my child in school anyway. I want to homeschool my child, or I want my child in a religious school where all the individuals involved in that school may share the same belief about vaccines or about medical care generally. Then you could see a lot of people that way opting out.
Yeah,
and not having the ability to enforce these rules against them necessarily.
Right, and that actually does happen a fair amount. And so this the other bucket of states have looked at ways that, if they can't, let's say, get rid of the personal belief exemption provided in their state's law, they've tried to find ways to maybe tighten the parameters a bit on how that personal belief exemption is claimed. So you'll see some states, let's say, requiring a parent to attest that they've undergone some educational training on the value of vaccines and the public health benefits and individual and collective benefits before being able to claim the exemption. Generally speaking, though, it's really just a form that is filled out and submitted to the school, as well as to the Department of Health in the state. So most states are still, leaving a lot of flexibility in place for personal belief exemptions, but some states have been trying to look at ways to strengthen it a little bit.
We talked on a recent episode about other ways in which individuals can be persuaded through law, regulation, statute, tax. To do something that is very widely believed to be something that promotes not only individual health but public health. And we talked recently as an example about soda taxes, and you and I spoke a little bit about that this morning. We're in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia has kind of gone under the radar to some extent compared to New York, where their big gulp or sweet drink tax got a lot of attention and was challenged legally, but it seems to be working pretty well in Philadelphia. I mean, there's no question that people consuming large quantities at one sitting and over the course of a childhood, let's say, of these of artificially sweetened and sugary drinks, there's a direct link to obesity and a direct link therefore to diabetes, and we're all paying the healthcare costs for that.
Right.
As well as the individual suffering the consequences of those conditions. So here you say, I want to tax you, or I want to tax these products to dissuade people from consuming them. That seems to be a good thing. It's not quite compulsory,
right?
In the same way that we're talking about, but it seems like another example of how, as a society, we're grappling with these great public health concerns and the costs of those problems. Individual costs, dollars and cents costs, actual costs, and what to do about them, and how to direct people, hopefully in the right direction. I guess the question is, do we universally agree on what that direction is? I mean, vaccines have always enjoyed a fairly universal acceptance, but now, with these doubts, whether valid or not, having entered in for some people, how are there other ways besides the ways that compulsory vaccine has been implemented? Are there other ways that we could consider?
Yeah, and there are, and some states have taken, I would say, lighter touch approaches to make vaccinations generally more available, and also providing a lot of education to parents just about where they can go to get the certain vaccines.
Yeah.
And also a lot of states have put quite a bit of time in developing sort of culturally appropriate materials in different languages to help reach all populations in a given state. We see that in particularly some of the larger states where you have a lot of variation in the populations. So that's another way that states have started to look at a more indirect way of sort of showing the value for vaccinations. But in public health, we do have this tension too between sort of the direct way of regulating, which is sort of the compulsory requirements, and then taxes, which are of course a bit more indirect, more of a nudge in the right direction. And unfortunately for vaccines, there really aren't a lot of good indirect ways to nudge, at least not anything that's quite as direct as a tax. There aren't sort of proposals for different types of taxes being thrown around for vaccinations, but really for vaccines, and particularly early childhood, we have historically just attached it to school entry, because that can be a way to just say, if your child is going to go to public or private schools in this state, in order to do that, you got to do the following. Unless there's an exemption, of course.
Well, I mean, that leads me to another thought too, which is, what are the authorities at this point in 2019 on this subject? We actually, with a different guest, talked recently about the question of truth and democracy and the erosion. We're in an era, we talk about our politics, where, I mean, I use the phrase fake news. I mean, it's thrown about, and institutions that for generations enjoyed wide acceptance for having credibility, our Supreme Court, doctors, science generally, the media. Now we question everything, and you don't have to dig too deep on the internet to find those who are denying things that many of us would just take as a given. Climate science, the fact that could be denied today is startling, that you could deny that the Holocaust happened. I mean, it seems incredible, and yet there are some in the population who's leaning toward denying, gets fed by what they're finding on it. So here we have something that enjoyed for so long wide acceptance in terms of its scientific validity, and yet we're facing a crisis, a public health crisis. So from your background, as a lawyer, a teacher, you work with these pharmaceutical companies who, whatever else they're doing, to the extent they're putting out vaccines, I mean, that's a good thing. Where do we go? Where does someone who has doubt, those who are, so dyed-in-the-wool deniers, there may be
It's a tough group to reach.
Yeah, there may be nothing you could say or show that person
right
to sway them. But for that person in the middle, you spoke of earlier, who's maybe for very good reason has doubt, where at this time in 2019 do you go? Who is the authority? Or where are the authorities on these subjects?
Yeah, unfortunately, there are a number of authorities that sort of a parent or a child could go to. It really starts with the primary care physician. So whoever's providing care to that child, they should really be having conversations with them about vaccinations and which ones are required and why. Why they're required. What are the benefits of that? We also see, state and local authorities through, let's say, a Department of Public Health playing a stronger role, having a much stronger voice, as we've seen the pitch get higher on the anti-vaxxer side, if you will. We've also seen departments of health in the states and local authorities as well playing a stronger role. in just providing very clear, easily digestible information about the value of vaccinations, which vaccinations should be received at a given point in a child's life, for example. And you know,
it costs money though, right?
They do,
they
yeah.
have to spend money on that.
Yeah, they do, and that's, you know, that's been the tricky thing. And you know, I think with many of the early childhood vaccinations, that tends to not be as big of an issue, but we still have an access issue, right? Because if you can't get to the person who's going to give you the vaccine, whether in most cases for early childhood it's a physician that's going to do it, but sometimes later in life it can be a pharmacist. You know, if you can't get there, if you can't prioritize getting there, you know, if you're working a few jobs and if you're just a busy schedule, it's probably not going to be very high on your list. You know, you're not going to I would put vaccines at the top of my list, but, you know, a number of other people probably wouldn't. So even though we don't have the same issue that we have around access from a financial standpoint, we still do have that issue very prevalent just in a physical and geographic access standpoint as well.
Well, and I guess I'll close with this. We've talked about measles mostly because, you know, that's sort of the immediate fire that's burning, you know, in this whole area. But since you brought up access, and how do people know about even the need? And there are other vaccines that we care about throughout our life, and we are in the middle of flu season. So I have to close by asking you this, and especially because. And I've never had this experience before. As a matter of fact, last night I got a call on my cell phone, and I'm used to not answering calls on my cell phone if I don't know the number. But it was at least the local area code, and something possessed me, and I answered the call, and it turned out to be my local Rite Aid saying, "Why haven't you come in for your flu shot?" And I thought, wow, you know, I certainly know where the Rite Aid is, and I can get there, and I can pay for the shot. I just haven't done it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you know, and I actually appreciated the phone call, and I'm going to make a point of going and getting that done.
Good example of outreach right there.
Right. I thought that was pretty good, but I have to ask you, someone who knows, and I know flu shots have also been somewhat controversial because, you know, are they really effective? Because the flu virus morphs and changes, you know, year to year to year. Is the balance of science today still favoring getting a flu shot, even though it may not protect quite as completely, say, as we know the measles vaccine protects against measles?
Yeah, it still is heavily in favor of getting that flu shot. It, as you were noting, it kind of has been a bit of a moving target. They designed the particular vaccine based on sort of the expectations for the virus for that particular year. So in recent years, as you were noting, the effectiveness has been sort of low, but recently the effectiveness rates have actually been rather high, particularly for this year. But at the same time, you know, a little bit of effectiveness can also reduce the length of the flu if you do contract it, so it can reduce the symptoms. So there still is some value, even if it's not fully 100% effective there. So all that is to say, those folks from Rite Aid were giving you a call for a good reason.
Okay. Well, now with you having said that, now I'm absolutely convinced that I'm going to go do this weekend. And thank you. Thank you so much, Nick, for coming in and for helping us understand what's going on and what are some of the steps that are being done. And of course, I'm sure you're going to recommend that all parents talk to their primary physician for their children and for themselves to understand what they should do in this regard.
Yeah, very much so. It's always good to have that regular conversation with your PCP about vaccines and pretty much everything related to health, and that goes for adults as well.
So Nick Diamond, who is a consultant in Washington on vaccines, works with many of the major vaccine manufacturers, and also teaches issues of law and public health at Georgetown Law School and GW Law School, both in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much, Nick.
All right, thank you.